having a satellite going over a particular area at a particular time was virtually zero. I think in this sort of search, this sort of terrible incident, this terrible tragedy, the one has to have hope. And I think, but it really was, as I said at the time, it was looking for not just a needle in a haystack, but a needle in a field of haystacks. You're not even sure which haystack the needle's in. In terms of the currents, and in terms of the timing and where they were discovered, it fits in very well with the aircraft going down sort of about 1,000 kilometers off the southwest tip of Australia. It did sort of sink to the seafloor, is now possibly sliding down slopes into valleys, into crevices. It certainly would have been covered slowly by, over this time, light sediments. We get a lot of biology. Modern sonar, modern what we call side scan sonar or imaging sonar is very, very good, but it's got a very narrow width. You're looking at a very narrow part of the, you're looking down. If we're talking about modeling and sort of backtracking, say, in a coastal area, it's very, very difficult. MH370 went down in one of the most remote parts of the oceans, in the Southern Ocean, south of Australia. The chances of finding anything on those satellite images were slim.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience from around the globe. This is your host, Sid, and it is wonderful to have you back with us for another episode of Sit Down with Sid podcast, where we bring people together one conversation at a time. A quick note before we begin. MH370 remains a complex mystery with many conflicting theories. The views expressed by our guests are their own. Our goal is to provide a platform for various perspectives to be heard as we continue to piece together the story. Joining us today is Dr. Simon Boxall, a distinguished oceanographer and senior lecturer at the University of Southampton. Dr. Boxall has spent his career exploring the physics of our oceans, from the intricacies of marine pollution to the massive dynamic systems of the deep sea. Dr. Boxall brings a critical scientific lens to one of the greatest maritime mysteries of our ages. By bridging the gap between cold, hard, bathymetric data and the public's search for answers, he reminds us that the vastness of the Indian Ocean is not just a backdrop to this story. It is a central character. Dr. Boxall, it is a profound honor to have you here, and thank you so much for taking the time.
It is an honor to be here on your channel.
Thank you. Okay, so to start off, could you give our listeners a brief background on your work at the National Oceanography Centre, and what specifically drew you to the MH370 investigation back in 2014?
Well, I work for the University of Southampton, which is based at the National Centre. And I'm a physical oceanographer, as you said. We worked all around the world. I have a team of scientists work with me and specialise in particular on things like ocean circulation. But also we do a lot of media work. So when there are major incidents at sea, whether it's the loss of an aircraft or a yacht or something, or a big oil spill, or tsunami, then quite often we end up sort of helping the public understand what's going on. So one of my roles is public understanding of science within the university.
Great. And you have written about the public's struggle to grasp the sheer scale of the Indian Ocean. From your perspective, what is the biggest misunderstanding people have about searching for a small object in such a vast, deep, and dynamic environment?
I think it's that people don't really appreciate how vast and remote the oceans can be. If we gave every single person on the planet, that's, over 8 billion people, their own personal swimming pool, 2 meters deep, made up of seawater, we would each have a swimming pool that was over 90 square kilometers big. That is huge. So it gives you an idea of how vast the oceans are, but also how remote they are. MH370 went down in one of the most remote parts of the oceans, in the Southern Ocean, south of Australia. And in that area, we have better maps of the moon's surface and the surface of Mars now than we do of our own ocean seabed. And actually, if you look at the data we had for that area, it's an area that has, I hate to say it, very little commercial interest at the moment. And so there were very few maps of that sea floor. So they were working when they were searching for a potentially lost aircraft in a vast ocean, um, which we knew very little about at the time.
Wow. I want to take you back to 2014, when early in the search, there was a public expectation that satellite imagery would provide immediate answers. Can you explain why eyeballing satellite photos is so prone to error in that specific region of the Southern Indian Ocean that you just mentioned?
I think it's a problem wherever you work. I think we get used to looking at things like Google Earth, where you can literally zoom in. The first thing everyone does in Google Earth is they go and find their own house. Then they might go and find where they work. And they can zoom in, you can almost see which car's in the drive. You can see all those details. But what people don't realize is that they are very specialized satellites. And those satellites only pass over once every few months. And in fact, most of those images are also a combination of satellite data and aircraft data. So when we look at normal satellite circulation over the Earth, if we're looking at daily images, then those daily images have a much lower resolution. We're looking at resolution maybe of 200 or 300 meters. So it wouldn't pick up an aircraft in the sort of the normal daily overpasses. So the chances of having a satellite going over a particular area at a particular time was virtually zero. What it can do, though, by looking at those long-term images, those higher resolution images, is potentially pick up the sort of flotsam and jetsam of the oceans. And what they did was they did a very clever job. They did some sort of citizen science. And because there was so much data, so many images, you're covering an area which is vast. They got citizen science to look at images to see if they could spot anything. And what they found was that we realized the ocean is full of flotsam and jetsam. There's all kinds of rubbish in the ocean. There were lots of false positives. There was one very, I suppose, tongue-in-cheek. It was a genuine suggestion from one of the newspapers in the UK. I won't say which one, where they convinced that they'd found MH370 sitting in the jungle to the north of where it took off, sitting there complete, as a complete plane. What the editor or the person posting the story didn't realize was that was just a picture of a plane going through the sky over a jungle area. So the chances of finding anything on those satellite images were slim. And even then, it was still worth doing, because if you found anything, if there was a chance in those very early days of picking up survivors, then it was obviously well worth doing. But as time goes on, whatever's on the surface usually tends to sink down or go below the surface. And so, the chances of picking up small residues on the surface is virtually zero.
Wow. I'm going to come back to you later on during this show. I want to talk about, the challenges, especially the area where the Ocean Infinity conducted search. So I'll come back to the arcs and so forth. Now, back to the search. Now, can you describe what it was actually in the control rooms during the search? Because, what was the mood when a ping turned out to be a false alarm, and how did the team manage that constant oscillation between hope and disappointment?
I think in this sort of search, this sort of terrible incident, this terrible tragedy, the one has to have hope. And I think if one's being realistic, people who have worked at sea realize that hope was very, very thin, very slim. But you have to try. There's a possibility in the early days that you might find a survivor or two. You don't know exactly what happened to the aircraft. Did it land? Um, I don't think an aircraft can ever land neatly on the water, but if it did, there's a chance that people could have escaped from the aircraft. Most aircraft will carry some form of, or the life raft will carry some sort of transmitter. The fact they weren't transmitting is disconcerting. But also, I think the search after the first few days came down to, could they find the aircraft and could they find the black box? Now, that is problematic because, you're working in water that's very deep. We're talking about kilometers deep, several kilometers deep. And you're looking at something which in an airport is huge. You look at an aircraft in the airport and it's absolutely huge. You look at it as it goes over your house, it's absolutely huge. But it really was, as I said at the time, it was looking for not just a needle in a haystack, but a needle in a field of haystacks. You're not even sure which haystack the needle's in. And although we have some amazing technology these days to pick up things from the seabed, you've got to be pretty much on top of it. And the best way I described it was someone somewhere in, let's say, London, throws a pound coin on the street, and your job is to go and find it in the dark. That's the sort of task you've got. Um, so, it was an immense task from the outset, but it was a task worth following, and the technology was there to help. But there's always going to be hope, and the hope really, even today, people are still going out there searching in the hope of finding a black box.
It's unbelievable if you look at the on the broader aspect of this mystery 12 years later. And as you said, there is still a lot of interest. And uh, let's talk about the technology. We often hear about the state-of-the-art sonar and deep sea submersible. Why were those tools that were available during the initial search, 2014 to 2017, not the silver bullet the public thought they were?
The size of the ocean, that's the simplest explanation. And also, of course, we didn't know at the time, but they have spent a lot of time in those first couple of years. A company called Geos did a huge survey funded by the Australian and the Malaysian government of the region. And in that survey, they discovered things like canyons the size of the Grand Canyon they didn't know existed. They discovered mountains the size of Mont Blanc they didn't know existed. And so if you can imagine that you're searching for something and you aren't even aware of the fact you've got sediments, the aircraft could be in a valley in the deep sea, it could be in pieces, parts of it could be in the valley, could be buried in sediments. It's such a sort of wide range of I suppose the benthic environment there is so wide ranging that actually trying to pick these things up in that benthic environment, modern sonar, modern what we call side scan sonar or imaging sonar is very, very good, but it's got a very narrow width. You're looking at a very narrow part of you're looking down, and you're probably only looking at um, a swath, an area probably about 300 or 400 meters across. So you can imagine painting in Britain, we say the Forth Road Bridge. You can imagine painting the Golden Gate Bridge with a small child's paintbrush. That's the sort of task you got. And so, although the technology is great, it's difficult. The other thing they were looking for were the ping from the pinger. Now, the pingers are designed, they have pingers, they're sort of acoustic beacons that sit on the black box or black boxes, because there's two black boxes. And those are supposed to ping as soon as it hits water. The idea being that it enhances the chances of getting a black box back, particularly if it gets separated from the aircraft. The problem is it's deep water, and the pingers weren't really designed to go to that sort of depth. Plus the fact they have a limited battery life. And so the big race was on to try and pick up any pings um, before the whole system disappears. But of course, if the uh, bat boxes are in a valley or they're buried in sediment, those pings become inaudible. The other problem was there were so many people out there searching. There were ships from different governments from around the world, all towing equipment looking for these pingers. And there were several false positives because at one stage, everyone got very excited about the fact they picked up a pinger. They thought they located it. They then focused the study in the area for several days until they realized the pings they were hearing was actually from someone's equipment. Because quite often on our own equipment, we've got equipment that costs hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars. So our own equipment, we quite often put pingers on so we can recover them. What was happening was that I won't say which country, but one of the country's ships, the pingers were activating when they put them in the water. And so everyone was chasing after the piece of kit that we were using to try and find the aircraft. So that was a bit of a wild goose chase, unfortunately. And that does happen. It's a tricky one because you want as many groups as possible helping. You've got more chance of finding something. But in the same breath, um, the fewer the better because you're not tripping over each other. And that was part of the problem in that initial search for MH370.
Very interesting perspective you just shared. I want to talk about the debris. So when the debris is located, let's talk about like the pieces of flaperon that were found in the Western Indian Ocean. I have two questions on this. First is how complex is it to perform reverse drift modeling? And my second question is, how much do wind, waves, and surface currents complicate the task of tracing that debris back to the origin point?
If we're talking about modeling and sort of backtracking, say, in a coastal area, it's very, very difficult. If we're looking at the open ocean, modern day models are very efficient. There are teams at the National Oceanography Centre, not part of my group, but who do that modeling. In Australia, there's a chap called Cherry Patriarchi who did a lot of work on this particular study, along with Roger Proctor and the team there at University of Western Australia. Um, and that team did a lot of reverse modeling to try and find out if they, when they found, first of all, finding out where debris might go, if they know roughly where the aircraft went down, so they know where to look for debris, and then going backwards, backtracking. And it's fairly accurate. But of course, the first debris was found almost a year later. And so backtracking that much in that area becomes less reliable. You've got an area that is very seasonal. So you have the monsoons, which affect the certainly the northern and the western Indian Ocean. Those monsoon seasons give you very variable winds, very variable currents as well. So that complicates things. But the basic sort of premise is that where the aircraft we think went down, this is based on this tracking from the Rolls-Royce pings that were sent back to Rolls-Royce to help keep an eye on the engines and the engine management, not as a tracker at all. And in fact, it was the incredible team at Rolls-Royce that managed to, if you like, back engineer a way of finding out where the aircraft might have been to within a few hundred kilometers. But I mean, that's still a huge area. It sort of sat on the boundary between what we call the Antarctic circumpolar current, which would have taken any debris right out into the Pacific Ocean. It would have gone around around Antarctica towards the east, and what would be the Flinders Current, which becomes the Western Australian Current. And it's evident from the debris found that it was the Western Australian Current that picked up the debris, took it up sort of past Australia, and then round the what we call the South Equatorial Current, and took it towards the first sighting, of course, was on the island of Réunion, which would have been, if you like, right in the path of that particular flow. And then they later found stuff on the beaches in East Africa as well. So the discovery of the wreckage, the discovery of the various parts of the plane, which were verified by looking at the part numbers, that fitted in with the aircraft going down where people thought it did, but you cannot pinpoint it. You're looking at deciding roughly, for example, whether it went down in sort of, I suppose the equivalent would be which country within Europe did it go down in, or which 3 or 4 states in the States in US did it go down in. That's as much pinpointing as you're going to get from that sort of backtracking. So it's still a huge area to search.
Wow. And since you brought it up, I know the Flatteron was found in Reunion, and then the other parts of debris were found like Mozambique in Africa. Uh, how do you reconcile these different arrival dates? And does the biological evidence, such as shell growth, force us to rethink drift models that suggest an origin which is even further north to where they are searching or where they search?
The discovery, in terms of the currents, and in terms of the timing and where they were discovered, it fits in very well with the aircraft going down sort of about 1,000 kilometers off the southwest tip of Australia. And that was part of the problem. It's a long way from the coast. We're looking at an area that's beyond helicopters. And I think people assume that there are teams of helicopters ready to mobilize and go in searching. The range of helicopters is fairly limited, so you're limited to quite large aircraft to do those sorts of journeys, particularly if they're spending time on site doing surveys and things. But it fits in perfectly with the premise that the aircraft went down in that particular area. It doesn't detract from that. We might argue small shifts one side or the other, but certainly in terms of and there's been, as you mentioned, the interesting papers on the biological growth on the various parts found. And by looking at sort of the biological growth, they can sort of almost fingerprint the waters it would have gone through, but it doesn't actually disagree with the idea that it was found that it would have gone down in the area that they started the search in. We're talking about plus or minus hundreds of kilometers. We cannot pinpoint it that much. Certainly with the biological activity, it's not that accurate.
But even these plus minus 100 kilometers in such a vast ocean makes a big difference when you're looking for a needle in a field of haystacks, as you mentioned.
Yeah. But of course, this is a year on. So, I mean, the problem here is that, first of all, in that year, certainly there'd be sort of nothing very much at surface. It would have been dispersed through the oceans, and it could well be sitting there in gyres going round and round the Indian Ocean for the next 100 years. Some of it might well have got caught up in the Antarctic circumpolar current, in which case it's sitting there going around in a journey of tens of years. Um, but it doesn't really, it's, it doesn't really help pinpoint where things were found. And of course, over that length of time, when you then go back to those areas, the anything that did sort of sink to the seafloor is now possibly sliding down slopes into valleys, into crevices. It certainly would have been covered slowly by, over this time, light sediments. We get a lot of biological activity around the circumpolar current. What that means is that every year there's a sort of a raining down of detrital matter from all the various blooms and things that occur on the surface, and that starts to layer sort of a sediment layer on the seafloor in certain places. So, the longer it goes on, the chances of finding things becomes more and more remote, simply because what is there starts to get buried. And of course, the pinger would have died years ago. And so you're not looking anymore at trying to find an aircraft in an area of several tens of thousands of square kilometers, hundreds of 100 by 100 kilometers. You are now looking at very small items in a very large area.
Wow, that makes everything so challenging, and
It does, yeah.
initially, one of your early concerns was whether any potential wreckage would even stay afloat. What are the oceanographic variables that determine whether any aircraft part floats or hits the seafloor almost immediately upon impact on the ocean?
It depends very much on how the aircraft hits the water. Um, Without being too morbid, if the aircraft hits the water at high speed, then it's going to break up very quickly. Water is really solid at high speed. You may as well be flying into a brick wall, and that breaks things up. Now, yes, there are going to be parts that will float. In theory, it's got things like seat cushions, it's got under the seats life jackets and things. Unless they're trapped, they will float. But they then become part of the flotsam and jetsam very quickly, and they disperse. It's not just a question of they're following the current round. So it's not like they're at the surface and then they go off as a group together. The oceans are full of eddies, and those eddies, that's turbulence spreads things out. And so over the course of a year, certainly years, that stuff is spread out over a huge area. Um, as they get caught in eddies. And the current system there is still very complex. Although we talk about the main current system, there are still lots of there's a Southern Indian Ocean current, there's a counter current in the area, there's a big gyre to the northwest of Australia. All these things can trap any surface material. Any heavy stuff will go down to the seafloor. But as it goes down, it's going down through, several kilometers of water. And again, as it comes down, very heavy things will tend to go straight down, but some of the lighter stuff will not just go straight to the seabed, but sort of spread as it goes down. So again, you're looking at a wide spread of material on the seafloor.
Wow. You have also spoken about the roaring forties, the extreme wind and wave conditions in that part of the world. How do these conditions, from your point of view, affect the structural integrity of the floating wreckage, say, over the period of last 12 years?
If that material, and by now it would have been out of the roaring forties, if the material, or the high winds down there anyway, if the material is floating, it will tend to float. Now, some materials, some polystyrenes and things, will slowly absorb water, and they will become dense eventually and float below the surface, never to be seen again. Not necessarily on the seabed, but stuck maybe, a few tens of meters below the surface. Um, but in principle, it doesn't matter how rough the sea is. If it's floating, it'll stay floating. So a storm won't push material that's on the surface down. It'll still be buoyant, it'll still stay at the surface. But again, the big problem here is if you look at how much rubbish we as human beings throw into the ocean, how much gets lost overboard. If you look at the number of containers that fall off ships in storms, and then their material is sort of spread over the ocean. The only reason we can identify the parts that were found in Reunion and on West Africa, on the East African coast, was by the part numbers and by the serial numbers. A lot of the floating stuff, the life jackets, certainly some of the sort of people's coats and things like that, um, identifying them is very difficult. And the other thing is, if it's organic, then you'll find that, fish and the marine biota, the marine animals, will slowly sort of eat it up, as will bacteria. The oceans have got a lot of bacteria. We rely on the bacteria to get rid of things like oil spills and things. So all these things help to sort of break down stuff that ends up in the ocean.
Well, and given your research into how plastics and other materials circulate in the deep ocean, is it scientifically plausible that significant wreckage remains intact on the seafloor, or does the deep sea environment, as you said, it has a lot of bacteria, degrade these materials faster than we anticipate?
Not if they're plastics. If they're plastics, they'll still be there. It takes a long time for plastics to break down in the environment. We're talking, we'll give it hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years. We don't know. We've not yet had enough plastic to break down to work out how long it takes. So we are talking centuries. So yeah, if we one day have the ability to drain the ocean and then see what's there and sort of walk across the seabed, we would find bits of this material. The other thing is that in that deep water, quite a lot of the material from the plane, windows and things, will tend to survive quite long periods. But again, we're looking at very small, items on a very deep ocean. Finding them from the surface is very difficult. To then argue, well, why don't we use ROVs? Why don't we use submersibles? It is deep there, and submersibles. It's interesting. In the UK, for research, there's been a sort of we don't go down the manned or human submersible route because of the dangers, as we've seen in recent years. But and there's nothing wrong with that in terms of going down, but there's no great benefit. Um, so ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, are a good way of doing it, but you're then looking at an even smaller area of coverage. You're looking at it will be you going around London with your small pen torch looking for that £1 coin that someone put somewhere in the streets of London. It's not a question of it's an area the size of London and it's flat and there's a coin. It's in the streets of London somewhere. It could have been gone down a drain. It could be tucked under a tree somewhere. You're going around with your small pen torch trying to find it. And that's what it's like with both an ROV, remotely operated vehicle, and to a certain extent the sonar as well.
And Dr. Boxall, would you take a moment to tell our audience who, once again, is not that well versed in your field, uh, based on the current ocean infinity search, the search area, some of the search area, there is a lot of terrain. Could you explain to our audience how difficult it is for even these vessels with top of the state art technology to even go there and try to look for debris?
In terms of the terrain, it doesn't affect how the vehicles work. So the vessels can go across the train. I mean, the train is down in the deep ocean, so the vessels are on the surface. It doesn't affect them. They are still a long way offshore, so they're 1,000 kilometers offshore. Um, and that's a long way. And so you're not going to be going out there on a sort of a daily basis when you've got spare time to go and do a quick look. And it is in one of the more remote parts of the ocean. So again, you'd only go there with a specific purpose of looking for this wreckage. Now there's a ship out there at the moment which has been looking. I think it's on a no fees basis. Um, they obviously think there's a chance they might find something. Um, there's always hope. Um, but the working out there is not difficult. The weather doesn't help. Having worked in the oceans for many, many years, you're going to find even the most remote parts of the most stormy parts of the world, you get calm days. And when it's flat calm, I've been in the middle of the ocean where you've got a mill pond when there should be storms. Um, and it is almost eerily still. I've been in other areas which should be, pretty easy, somewhere like the North Sea, and the waves are huge. So, um, you have got a weather problem wherever you work. We get used to that as oceanographers. We work all around the world, and weather is one of our biggest enemies. So that does stop searches. But there's nothing particularly, it's the remoteness really of actually getting on site. You're taking days to get there in the first place with a ship normally. Research ships and survey ships aren't designed like liners or battleships to be fast. They're designed to get there efficiently and then work. We actually want most of our ships to go slowly because we're sampling. The last thing we need is a ship going along at sort of 30 knots or something, about 40 miles an hour, um, because we can't stop to sample. So it is about the remoteness. It is about the fact that you've got a dedicated ship. And these vessels aren't cheap. A research vessel these days depends on the size of the vessel. You're looking at well over $100,000 a day. You're looking at $150,000 a day.
Wow. Yeah. So the Ocean Infinity search, the current search that was concluded actually on March 8th,
Sorry.
March on March 8th, which was the 12-year anniversary, and they were supposed to search an area. I think it was 33 degrees south to 36 degrees south, and for some reason they turned around and I don't know if it was the bad weather. I mean, yes, weather does play a significant role. So as of now, there is no search going on, an active search, and once again, I don't know if Ocean Infinity will go for another round. Since it's a no
Yeah.
find, no fee based
The
model.
bad weather, there's two issues here. There's the safety of the ship and the crew and the scientists. And I know often you'll get people saying, I never get seasick. Trust me, there's no such thing as never getting seasick and affecting your efficiency. If someone ever says that to me, I will find a ship in a condition that will make them feel very ill, not on purpose. But the key thing here is that if the weather is rough, there's a danger of putting stuff over the side. Some of this kit is very heavy, and what you don't want is 4 or 5 tons worth of kit flying around your head in a storm. The other thing is that a rough sea will affect the way in which the sonar works. So once you get to much more than a force 5, then the sonar itself isn't working efficiently. You've got too many air bubbles in the surface. There's a whole load of reasons why you just cannot operate in those conditions. And bear in mind, of course, ships need fuel. They need fuel, they need water, they need food. And so most ships really can't be out there for more than 6 weeks. And bear in mind, this is a sort of remote part. So you're spending a lot of time and fuel and energy getting to site and getting back again. So, they do have to come back in to refuel, to change crews, to restock as well. So a combination of bad weather and just the need to replenish the ship on a regular basis are many reasons why it won't be out there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Unbelievable. I want to talk about theories. I mean, you have spent your career balancing academic research with public science communication. How do you approach the MH370 mystery when you're faced with popular, often unsubstantiated theories going around versus the cold oceanographic data that you work with on a daily basis?
It's interesting. MH370 is one of those stories that did have an awful lot of um, weird stories about them. And because I was involved with the media a lot during the actual search and during the initial stages. I did get quite a few calls and letters and emails from people saying they've solved the problem. And the conspiracy theories were amazing. You'd be surprised how complex some of them got. I think my favorite was someone contacted me to say they had a hotline to the Pentagon. Yeah. Um, and they spoke to the friend there and they were told what had happened. And apparently, you're going to like this, what happened was the Chinese were playing with some new missiles, and accidentally shot MH370 out of the sky. Now, there was an American warship in the area, and it was so cross it sank the submarine. Both China and America were so embarrassed about the whole thing that they decided they had to make up a story. So they got a Hercules in and put these trackers for the engines that MH370 had onto the Hercules and then flew them into the Southern Ocean to make it look like it was MH370. Yeah. There are so many things wrong with that, not least of which we know from experience that no military is that organized. And to be able to do all that in the space of an hour or two, no, no. But I mean, that's an extreme case. I know I've heard of aliens being responsible. Um, we don't know exactly what happened to those people on board, the tragic loss of those lives. Um, was it some sort of instrument failure? Unlikely. I think, when we look at things like why were the trackers, the actual proper beacons turned off? Why did it change course? We will never know the true story without the black box. But no, this is amongst all other areas. I think the only other area that we cover on a regular basis is the Bermuda Triangle. And the tales there are even more outrageous than the tales on MH370.
Perfect. Okay. I have a few more questions before we wrap this up. Now, many in the public suspect that there is information being withheld. From an oceanographer's standpoint, how do you find that the search area boundary aligned purely with the science, or were there political or military pressures that forced the search into areas that were scientifically less likely for the wreckage to be found?
No, I mean there's no reason for them to do that. It's a question of I think people assume that governments are nefarious in trying to do things. The evidence, the initial evidence of the route that the aircraft from a team of engineers in the UK and Rolls-Royce. The search was carried out by scientists, independent scientists. The sort of science behind it from scientists from around the world, really. From Australia, particularly University of Western Australia in Perth, from UK, from China, from Malaysia, and none of them had a particular reason to not try and find where the aircraft had gone. And there's no real apparent reason as to why any government would want to cover stuff up. So there are too many independent factors for one, if you like, controlling government to, I suppose, take control of the story and take control of the data. It is generally a mystery and it's a genuine sort of, it shows how difficult sometimes it is to work in the oceans.
Wow. And based on the oceanographic data that we have now on our hands, compared to what we knew in
Yeah.
2014, do you believe a renewed search using today's advanced technology has a statistically higher chance of success in finding the wreckage?
No, because as time goes on, the wreckage becomes more dispersed, and the time goes on, it becomes covered, it changes its format. So time, although technology hasn't advanced a huge amount in the last 10 years, it's advanced a bit. I'll be honest, it's advanced a bit. And obviously, now that we have from those initial searches a much better map of the seafloor and the area, it does help identify where things could have gone. You could identify canyons that might be worth investigating in a bit more detail. But the the problem is that on the one hand, technology has improved a little bit, and it is small steps. On the other hand, what wreckage there was is becoming more dispersed, more buried. Even the stuff on the sea floor, there are sort of deep ocean currents that will move things, unless they are very, very heavy. So somewhere there will be an engine sitting on the sea floor, which probably won't move a great deal. Although again, if it's on a slope, you can imagine it sitting on a mountain slope somewhere, and with time, it slowly slides down that slope. So yeah, as time goes on, things become more dispersed. We've already seen how what flotsam and jetsam there was from the aircraft has appeared, as we said earlier, in Réunion, along the East African coast. The fact that it's gone that far means that what was there has been very dispersed. And they will still probably find stuff washing up in years to come. Whether people are looking out for it in the same way as they were in the early days is another matter. It might well be stuff sitting on beaches around the world that people haven't even identified as being part of the MH370 wreckage. And the other part thing is, of course, when stuff does wash up at the beach, there's an assumption that we will find it. And you suddenly realize, although most of us spend our entire lives trying to find that remote, empty beach to go and enjoy for our holidays, huge amounts of coastline are completely uninhabited, or you don't have people going anywhere near them. So something could be sitting on a coastline somewhere around the world, certainly around the Indian Ocean, um, undiscovered.
Wow. Final question for you, Dr. Boxall, is based on your own extensive research and time you have spent on this, is there any one specific location in the Southern Indian Ocean you think they should do a renewed search if the search was allowed again by Malaysia? And,
No,
and to that, does it bother you till date that this is still a mystery and nothing has been found except few parts of the wreckage?
I think it will always remain a mystery, I'm afraid. I think the chances of finding any more is very, very slim. Any more significance. I mean, we may find odd bits washing up, but we're talking about, very small components. Not enough, I don't think, to actually identify what really happened on that fateful day. Um, it may sound pessimistic. You do sort of sit down and wonder at what stage do we put some of this huge amount of investment to supporting and helping the families that lost their loved ones and their fathers, their daughters, their mothers in this terrible crash. And there's a point at which you think, well, do we spend hundreds of millions of dollars chasing this needle in a field of haystacks? Or do you invest that money in supporting the families that lost people?
Wow. Uh, well, to our audience, I would like to first of all thank you very much for your incredible support that you've given us throughout the entire MH370 Deep Series dive coverage. If this conversation moves you, please share it. In a world of fleeting digital noise, our collective attention is the only thing that keeps the search for truth alive. By listening, you ensure this story and the 239 souls it represents are never truly lost to the deep. Dr. Boxall, this was a very interesting and quite a fascinating conversation I had with you. And there are some new things that I've learned today, which I had no idea about. So I want to thank you very much for your time and for sharing your perspective with our audience.
Sid, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye bye.